Hey everyone, I'm Tammy Salenberger, the author of The One Inside 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about who they are, the different parts of themselves, and for those who want to connect with their true self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
I am so excited to talk to Kathy Mackechney today about her chapter in the Altogether Us book. And why don't we start with where we always start, which is where you are in the world and what you would see if you look out your nearest window.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for having me. It's great to be here. And when I look out my window, I see the tomato plants that are bearing fruit. And if I lean one direction, I see a couple of the stalks of corn that we planted this year in one of our raised garden beds in our backyard. And then if I leaned over a little farther and I looked off in the distance, I would see a little bit of the mountains in the foothills of Denver, Colorado.
Lovely, lovely. So, um, how often do you have to go out into your garden and do the garden things?
I don't go out there as often as I should. Um, I probably should be out there, every couple of days. In fact, this morning I was noticing, oh, I need to get out there and do some more weeding. But um, I see this garden bed, from my office where I see clients for telehealth sessions. And I regularly notice my husband walking by, checking the harvest pretty much every day, plucking little cherry tomatoes. And
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, that's nice. That's nice.
yeah.
So it doesn't feel like you don't have a manager that's like, oh my gosh, you need to be out there doing that. Like you don't have this, like, because I feel like sometimes I'm looking outside and I'm like, yeah, I really need to clean that, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, no, I definitely have a part that every time I look out any window in my house says, oh, we need to get out there and take care of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is, whether it's the vegetable garden, the flower gardens, something with the house. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so, and I love when my parts are really active when I'm seeing clients. And then when I'm done and I have like 3 hours at home by myself, I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't what like wait, was there something I needed to do? No, I don't know. I love when
Yeah,
that happens.
I'm noticing feeling envy that that of having that big of a block of time between sessions because I have a part that is is just gonna, if I have a block like that, is gonna fill it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So gosh, if I had that much time, it is lovely. Every once in a while, I do have that kind of space between sessions, usually when someone cancels late.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I do fill it with other stuff, but it
Yeah.
is nice.
So tell me about your chapter, and I would love to hear if you feel comfortable a little bit of why this topic is so important to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that.
Okay.
So, I was honored to be asked to write this chapter and be included in the book because I believe it is important for adoptees to be recognized as the special population that we are. Um, and that's a great segue for me to talk about why this was so important to me personally and how I got here. And that is because I was relinquished at birth and placed in foster care for the first 10 weeks of my life and then placed with my adoptive family. So I was adopted and I grew up knowing that I had been adopted. I have two brothers. I had two brothers. This still feels strange for me to say. One of them died a year ago. But I grew up with two brothers who are my parents' biological children. And my mom and dad, and this was I should say, I was born and adopted in 1968. So my parents had their two sons, and then they tried again for many years to get pregnant a third time and were unable to. And my mom really wanted a girl, and my parents had some friends who had adopted, so they felt comfortable pursuing that route. So they decided to do that. And that was several years later. So I'm 9 and 10 years younger than my brothers. But I was adopted, and I grew up knowing that. And we didn't talk about it because at that time in history, adoptive parents were commonly counseled to tell their child, and then, just treat them the same as though they had been born to you. And since then, fortunately, people have learned you can't act like it's the same, because it's not, and it doesn't feel the same to the child. And so they know it's not the same. So you can't just act like it's the same. It's different. But we didn't talk about it because of what my parents have been told to do. And so then when I was 18, 19, a freshman in college, I had this assignment to write this paper for this class. And it was some kind of autobiographical paper. And seemingly out of nowhere, I suddenly wrote about my experience of having been adopted. And that brought back like all the questions, because I didn't remember what I had been told. My mom had told me what she knew, which wasn't much. It's what's considered non-identifying information. But she shared that with me. So that was things like my birth parents' heights and weights and their interests, and that why I had been put up for adoption. So my mom told me that, and I wrote this paper, and it passed. Like we went on with our lives. And then fast forward about 10 years, and I was at a point in my life. I'd gotten my undergraduate degree in journalism, and I was working in writing and editing, and I was considering making a career change because I was in therapy, and in therapy, I was talking about the issues for me from having been adopted. And I had done some reading. I'd read this book, The Primal Wound, which is one that many people in the adoptee community know. They may have different feelings about that book, but people tend to know of it. I had read that and a couple of other books, so I knew that I was not alone in what I felt. But my therapist hadn't read any of those books. And I kept finding myself in this position of having to educate my therapist about the issues that adoptees commonly face. And so I saw a niche, and I thought, adoptees need someone who gets it. They need a therapist who gets it. And I had been thinking about going back to school to get my MSW so I could become a therapist, and serve this population. And so I decided to pursue career counseling to make sure that that was going to be a good fit for me, becoming a therapist. And through that process, through the process of career counseling, I realized, for me to figure out what I really want to do, I need to figure out who I fully am. And so for me, that meant finding those missing pieces and the missing people who held those pieces from the beginning of my life. So that led me to search. And I was fortunate in that I was able ultimately, after some hurdles, to find my original mom, my birth mom. and make contact with her, and then make contact with my birth father and get to meet them. And the rest is history. So here I am.
Yay, I'm so glad. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here with me and that you wrote this chapter and that you provide such a special service for a population. And you talk about this in your chapter that isn't seen generally as like special, or that we would consider things about being an adoptee that, like, there were things in the chapter that I was like, I never thought about that. Like, I would never think about these triggering, the things that are so triggering, and not even thinking about the adoptee as its own special population that has special needs and special concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think part of the difficulty in seeing this population in this way is the terminology, starting with the term adoptee, which centers that the person was adopted. So it centers the adoption. And that's an adoptive parent and adoption professional centric perspective.
Right, right.
And it begs the question, well, why did this individual have to be adopted? There was something that happened first. And that's part of what I write about in the chapter, that first this person was relinquished or they were removed.
Okay.
And so that led to their having to be adopted. And, you know, you got adopted. Like, it sounds like a positive outcome, you know, and it also sounds like an end. Like, oh, you know, that's the end of that, you know, like taken care of.
Period. Yeah. You got adopted. Right. Period. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's this stuff, all this stuff that happened before then that's traumatic. It's the trauma of infant mother separation. And I credit a client with that language, a client who gave me that language and gave me permission to use it when they arrived at being able to describe it in a way that fit for them, which is a survivor of infant mother separation.
No, I know. I know Kathy just put her hand on her heart because both of us are like, oh, yes.
Yeah.
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 Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in the chapter, I often use the term relinquishee or relinquishee, you know, dash adoptee, relinquishee-adoptee, to try to capture, hey, wait a second. Remember, this had to happen first. And this is what often leads adoptees to therapy, is that infant mother separation. And the tremendous impact on them of having been separated from their mother. And something else I write about in the chapter is that when adoption is at play, it seems like what happens in our society is we just so easily like forget how important the mother is. Like, we know this, right? Babies are handed to their mothers. They are placed on her chest. And then it's as though, oh, there's an adoption plan. Okay, oh, we don't have to do that. And it's like, what? We can just hand that baby to someone else, like the baby wouldn't know. And I write in the chapter about how, you know, we're not born adoptees. We're born the same as everybody else, born to our mothers, just like everybody else, having, you know, grown in her womb, knowing her rhythm, her voice, you know, the feel of her smell. And when we're handed to someone else, and in my case, and in many cases, we weren't handed to anybody. There wasn't anybody there. But nowadays, it's more common for people to be handed to the prospective adoptive mother. It's not like the baby doesn't know that, you know, they know that this is, it's like, wait a second, this isn't mother. This isn't where's mom? Where's my mother? And it's a trauma.
I'm having feelings.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
I have a client who I adore, and she's been adopted, and I feel like your original therapist, I think she's taught me a lot about what it means to be adopted. And one of the things that she talks about is what you're saying is the idea that there's so much focus on the parents, right? The parents, and the idea that like the parents, like, good job for you for like saving this kid out of the gutter, and that the kid should be
Mhm,
thankful. Like, aren't you thankful that you were adopted? And
mhm.
there's sort of two things, like so much focused on the adoptive parents, and then focused on the kind of idea that like you should be lucky that you got adopted.
Right. It's the
Yeah.
whole savior narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes a lot of us kind of want to gag, right? Um, because wait a second, you want me to be grateful that I was separated from my mother and had to be adopted by a stranger, because that is how adoptive parents start. They start as strangers. And you want me to feel grateful for that? And I mean, further, you're imposing that on me
Yeah.
instead of allowing me to maybe, if I get there, to get there on my own. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like, as an adoptee myself, it's not like I don't feel gratitude for the things that my parents, my adoptive parents, did give me, but I needed to be allowed to get there, in my
Yeah.
own way, in my own time, as part of my own process, and
Yeah.
not be told that I should feel
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. 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 And I think that often, we probably all have parts that if you tell me I should feel a certain way, that I have parts that are going to be like, nope, not going to
Yep.
do that.
Yeah. Right.
Relinquish also gives me some feelings. Like when I was reading the chapter, I felt myself being like surprisingly, I guess it's not that surprisingly, it's probably not that surprising that I was emotional about it because I'm, but but I did have big feelings about the word relinquished versus
Mm-hmm.
adoptive seems like it's just a normal word we use. And I don't have any feelings about that. But the
Mm-hmm.
relinquished, I was like, oh, there's more
Mm-hmm.
punch to that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I think that's a good thing because it gives people a feeling of, just a little taste of the feeling of what we carry, of
Yeah.
what adoptees carry. Yeah, that's right. That, like, that heavy feeling, that heaviness, the burden of that, that's what we carry. And it has often felt like we carry that alone because the word is adoptee, and what's centered is adoption, not relinquishment or removal. And in the cases of transracial adoptions, adoptions from other countries, the layers of that, of what was lost when you were relinquished or, taken out of there, out of that country, out of that family, out of that country, they just add up.
In the book, you say it was essential for me to connect with my original birth mother in order for my part to be able to connect, or parts of me that are able to connect and trust me myself. So there's something about
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
needing to meet your birth mother in order to connect to you. So tell
Mm-hmm.
me about that.
Mm-hmm.
I was so
Yeah.
curious about that.
Yeah. And again, I just want to name how fortunate I am. I consider myself one of the lucky ones that I have been able to meet my birth mom and know her and know who she is, because this isn't possible for everyone who was relinquished and adopted. And unfortunately, it won't be possible for everyone. I mean, it's becoming more and more possible for more of us, but it's not going to be possible for everyone. So I just want to name that I'm fortunate in that I got to do that. Um, and in meeting her and, discovering parts of me that resemble her, that are like her, that have similar mannerisms. It, like I said, filled in some of those missing pieces. It really gave me back some of those missing pieces or parts. And I believe that for people who were relinquished and adopted, the more they are able to know those missing parts that can get lost in relinquishment and adoption, then the more they are ultimately able to access self-energy, because they've got all their missing parts like back together with them. So there's, they remain connected to them, but like in this sense that's farther away. And when you meet those people, like birth mom, birth dad, or whatever language people use for them, first mom, original mom, or just mom or dad, when you meet them, you've got an opportunity to reunite not only with them but with some of these missing parts of yourself, which in my experience opens up more access to self-energy. And the other thing is that for many people who were relinquished, self itself gets exiled.
Ooh, okay. Tell me about that.
So these parts, these very young parts, arrive at the conclusion, understandably, that, oh, it must have been because of self that we got relinquished. And so we need to keep that out. We need to exile self. It's not thought out like that, but that's in essence what happens. And so self gets exiled and these parts take over, right? They just become very blended. And so that's often what we are working with a relinquishee-adoptee. We're working with someone who's very blended. And I write about this in the chapter, the importance of using direct access, implicit direct access, especially, to build that trust with parts so that they can relax enough to be able, to get to that point where they can say, oh, maybe I can trust you, right? The self of the client, because they've experienced some of that with the therapist, with the self of the therapist. And so through that process of using implicit direct access to build trust with those parts, they come to trust the self of the adoptee. And that opens up more access. And then you can use insight from there. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And we hear that in all types of different with different groups, how there is lack of sense of trust in self.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That then, okay, so interestingly, thinking about kind of identity and sort of missing parts of identity, then
Mm-hmm.
the parts that are blended that kind of think they're you or think that you're self, like that's also part of the, I don't want to say issue, but part of what's going on is that like you're so blended with these, which is true for all of us, but right, we're so blended with these parts, they think that they're us, but it becomes more complicated when there's parts missing or parts because of the relinquished situation.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Exactly.
I'm like, did I just say that right? Okay, good.
Yeah, right. It's just more complex or complicated. And
that I don't know
so,
that we're really paying attention to that, right? Like if I just think like, oh yeah, you're adopted. Okay, anyways, you're having a problem with your job. Like you're right.
right.
Okay, so you're here because you're anxious. So let's talk about your anxious, and so I'm taking your history and oh, you're adopted. Okay. And you're
Yeah.
one of 3 children. Like I'm just adding, and you were born in
Right.
Boston. You know what I mean? Like I'm just sort of using that as like just collecting information and not really realizing that that is going to be, I think I'm jumping subjects a little bit, but I'm like, really sort of honing in on this idea that that needs to be part of the conversation, and
Yeah.
that's impact on the system.
Yeah. I would say at a minimum, it is something to note and maybe return to. And I make this distinction in the chapter too, because, sometimes I will hear from clinicians, well, what is it that they'll say about working with an adoptee? I mean, I'll hear from people, it doesn't seem to be an issue for them. And yeah, true enough. So not every person who was relinquished and adopted comes to therapy for help with that. They may come to therapy for another presenting issue. And then, like you were describing, you'll learn through the intake process, oh, they were adopted. But if you are informed about what that can mean for someone to have been relinquished and adopted, then you can be listening, right? In a more informed way with your parts detector ears.
Yeah.
As you focus on whatever it is they want to focus on, for any indications of how this might be related to having been given up by their original mom.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well,
an opportunity. Go ahead.
No, you go.
An opportunity. So an opportunity might present itself, later in the therapeutic process to explore that a little bit. But these are not my clients. My clients come to me to focus on adoption related issues. So everybody that I see is coming in because they were relinquished and adopted, and they're at a point where they've decided, I need some further help with this. Like, they've recognized this impacted me, in a significant way. It impacts me in my, relationships. It impacts me in this way. And I could use some help with it. And so the focus for me with my clients is always on exploring these, what are commonly referred to as adoption related issues.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you do see as adoption related issues?
Yeah, I can try to talk a little bit about that. So it's kind of a big question, but
that's what I was thinking, right? Like,
yeah, but I would say that, and I list some of these in the chapter as well as on my website. It's things like, well, I want to be close, and, part of me wants to be close, and, part of me pushes the person away. I like to be in control. Gosh, any number of issues in relationships.
So
So,
is it usually seen in relationships, and is it identity and relationships, or where you're going to see kind of the parts show up the most?
Often, often. And I would say, it kind of depends on the developmental stage of the person. So I see people of all ages. So, like in adolescence, certainly identity is going to be a component of it, and relationships. And I'd say relationships throughout the lifespan.
Wow,
The
okay.
impact on the person in relationship throughout the lifespan is significant because of what happened in that very first relationship. And the impacts of that are lifelong.
Yeah.
And sometimes adoptees get lucky. They're fortunate to be, placed with an adoptive parent who's very attuned to that loss and the significance of it. And, does the necessary attachment repair work with them, for them to be able to thrive in relationships. But a lot of adoptive parents aren't aware of that, or don't really know how to do that, or aren't doing their own work, right, with their, own attachment wounds and burdens to be able to be the really successful adoptive parent that their child needs.
Yeah.
But those relationship issues, and I would say control, some self-doubt, second guessing oneself, like, second guessing everything I say, or, I just left this time with this person, we just had this conversation. I just had, lunch with a friend, and I leave and I start second guessing all these things I said. and worrying that maybe I offended them, or, oh, I wish I had said that. So difficulty conveying what they want to convey, to, like being able to find their voice, to say what they really want to say, or even knowing what they really want to say. I would say these kinds of things are common adoptee issues.
Okay. Okay. What about the idea of I think we probably have already covered this, but the idea of, I like we talked originally about the terms, and one of the terms you use is biologicals. And so you say that we need to educate biologicals about why adoptees should be recognized as a marginalized group.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about that. So first of all, the credit for that term goes to my friend and colleague, Shatra, word aliker. She is also an adoptee who works with other adoptees. She's also a therapist here in Denver, and she gave me that term, biological, to refer to people who were born and raised in their biological families. It's like, oh yeah, we have a term. They should have one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most people assume that you're a biological, because that is the case for most people were raised in the families into which they were born. So it makes sense. And so that's the dominant perspective, right? And that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what gets missed is that there are these, millions of people who came into their families differently, and who walk through the world not knowing who they resemble and not being able to know, because although this has changed, many of us, if not most, still don't have access to our original birth certificates, and live with a falsified document that is called our birth certificate, that has our adoptive parents' names on it as the people to whom we were born. And we are, as far as I know, the only group of people who don't have access to their original birth certificate. And the way that, these triggers occur can be really subtle, just going through day-to-day life. And, like being in a store and seeing a family together, and, obviously they're a family because they all resemble one another. And it reminds you again of how alone you can feel, because you don't know. You don't know who you resemble. You don't know who your people are. Or you go to the doctor and, they're asking for family history and you don't know it. And, and then sometimes, like I experience this, they can be rather dismissive of it. Like, well, if you did know, you wouldn't do anything, we wouldn't have you do anything differently. We'd just be monitoring you like we are. And it feels really dismissive. It's like, oh, it's important for everybody else, but suddenly, because I don't know it, it's not. And so there are just all kinds of little things that can happen. And like even intake paperwork, any kind of intake paperwork, like you fill out at a physician's office, or, with a therapist or anyone else, when they're gathering family history under the assumption that your biological parents raised you, you feel excluded. So there are all these ways that you walk around knowing and experiencing, yep, that not me, that doesn't apply to me. Nope, I'm different. Nope, separate. And you're always like one out.
Yeah. You're othered often.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I know we're running a little bit out of time, but I wanted to ask about this term that you use and that you've used at the conference. I know you presented at the IFS conference, but this term or this phrase, not all parts get adopted. So tell me about that phrase.
Yeah. Thank you. So speaking of those missing parts or those missing pieces, so this is something that came to me one day. I was like walking through my house and it popped into my head, not all parts get adopted. And I was like, I just kind of started nodding and thought, yep. It just felt like a truth that came. And I presented a workshop on it at the conference that year. That was in 2019, the last in-person conference we had before this upcoming one. And the focus of it is on trying to find and connect with some of those parts that got cut off by relinquishment and adoption. And they get cut off for different reasons. They get cut off because they didn't want to get adopted. And so they didn't. They stayed where they were and stayed close to mom, that to birth family, close to the city where they were born, the country where they were born, to maintain their connections to that place. Or they didn't get adopted because other parts didn't want them to get adopted, because the adopted parts thought that they would be a threat to the placement, and didn't want to risk losing another family. Or they didn't get adopted because the adoptive parents didn't want them. And I mean, this can happen with any parent and child, right? That there are parts of the child that the parent doesn't want and rejects. But in this case, these are parts that don't get adopted because maybe they remind the adoptive parent that their child isn't theirs biologically, or reminds them of the birth parents in some way, and so they don't get adopted for that reason. There are other reasons, that we can discover that parts don't get adopted, but I love doing that. I love offering the workshop, and my dream is to turn it into a retreat, because we really need 3 days, I feel like, at least, to explore these different types of parts and reunite with them.
Well, and that's the hope. That's the hope, or I guess that's the hope, is that you can reunite with them. Like, they are not lost, and self isn't lost, and these parts aren't lost.
No, they're just waiting, and they're often, some of them were never burdened because they didn't get relinquished and adopted. They just stayed where they were and didn't go through those traumas and weren't burdened by them. And they, to use one of Dick's terms, they can be some of the juiciest parts of ourselves, right? And they've got all this energy and joy and life to offer our systems. And they can also feel like kind of a direct line to self and self energy. And so it can be really enriching to reunite with them. And we also have to take that slowly and carefully and thoughtfully, and ask for permission from parts that might feel scared to try to find those parts, and might feel scared that they will be replaced if we find those parts. And so, we have to check in with them and ask for permission. And then and a lot of stuff can come up in the meantime, and we have to address that first, right?
Yeah.
Before we can go there.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
And so if people want to find you and get to know you, how can they find you and get to know you?
The best way is through my website, adopteetherapy.com, and more specifically to email me at Kathy@adopteetherapy.com. And they can also find me on Instagram. I think it's hard for people to imagine the trauma of being separated from one's mother at birth, and the impact of that. That's so big. I think that's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But to the degree that biologicals can imagine not knowing, and I know, sometimes you'll hear a biological say, I wish I had been adopted, right? I understand why they say that, but it also reveals their naivete. Yeah, because they don't really know what it's like, because they're not thinking about what has to happen
Yeah.
in order to get adopted, what precedes that. So I guess that's what I want to leave people with is remember, that's the most important thing, is to remember someone had to get relinquished at birth or shortly after, or be removed from their mom and dad in order to get adopted. And that's traumatic.
Kathy, thank you for sharing your heart and yourself and your story and your wisdom so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And can I ask I want to ask the last question that I always ask. So if you weren't doing what you're doing and you had to do something different, what would you do instead?
I would be spending more time in my garden and collecting the harvest. And I would spend more time in my kitchen, like chopping vegetables and, taking time to put together a beautiful homemade meal every day and have friends over to share that with.
That sounds great. I love that. I love that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And
thank you, Tammy.
You're welcome. And we will talk soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, like, all the things. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or all the places books are available. You can also visit my website, tammysallenberger.com, where you can download a free meditation on getting to know your should parts. You know, there's parts of you who remind you of what you should be doing. They sound a bit critical at times. Yes, we all have them. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and Twitter and the One Inside Facebook page. I'm so grateful for Jack Reardon, who created the new music. Jack is a graduate of Derek Scott's IFS Stepping Stone program. Thanks, Jack, for getting me. And to you, thanks for listening.